Well, all right, let's get cooking. Welcome to the latest edition of Chin Check Sports Radio. I'm your host, JB. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to listen to our program. And as always, we welcome any suggestions, feedback, comments, and criticisms, which improves the quality of our program, which ultimately improves your listening experience. On this particular broadcast, I wanted to really go in depth about something that I covered in the review for the Canelo Alvarez versus Sergey Kovalev fight broadcast that I did a few weeks ago. And I mentioned that in that particular fight, there was a delay because fans at the MGM Grand were watching the UFC fight in New York City, so basically across the country, watching a fight in New York City that was not even a real, by UFC standards, wasn't even a big championship fight. Matter of fact, it wasn't even a championship fight at all. And also, Canelo Alvarez is arguably the biggest star in boxing against a UFC fight card that the two guys who are fighting, George Masvidal and Nate Diaz, are not two of the UFC's biggest stars. And not necessarily by skill or ability, more by force of personality. So that got me thinking, is boxing in serious trouble? And I never want to ever say boxing is a dying sport, but their viewership seems to be sinking. There's reasons behind that. It only seems to be for us hardcore fight fans like you all who are listening to Chin Check Radio right now. And that's some of the reasons why I decided to create Chin Check Radio, because boxing to me seems to be losing the public, seem to be losing their audience. And let's kind of delve into those reasons why. Now, before we get started, the reason why that bothered me so much with the delay for the Canelo and Sergey Kovalev fight is because, and I'll tell you a little bit personal about me, December of 2003, I was in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where there was a mega fight card promoted by Don King Promotions, where it was headlined by Bernard Hopkins versus William Joppy, Hasim Rahman versus John Ruiz, Zab Judah versus Jaime Rangel. And it was a fight to end the year. So, of course, I was in attendance at the Atlantic City Boardwalk Hall, and the fight never got delayed. The fight went on as scheduled. Each fighter came out as scheduled, of course, with some filler time in case it was early knockout. But for the most part, there was no delay to watch any other combat event. In 2004, some friends of mine and I, we went to Madison Square Garden for Felix Trinidad's comeback fight versus Ricardo Majorca. And it was an electric atmosphere in New York City. For those of you who don't know, my folks back home in Jersey, and of course across the river in New York, Felix Trinidad was an absolute icon, a deity in New York City, especially amongst the Puerto Rican people. So we were there for that event. Of course, very entertaining fight with the classic brawler and Ricardo Majorca. And there was no delay. Fight went on as scheduled. In 2005, I went back to Atlantic City to watch Vladimir Klitschko versus Nigerian puncher Samuel Peter in a great undercard fight with Miguel Cotto versus Ricardo Torres. Again, that fight, both fights went off. They went off as planned. There was no delay. Fights started on time. In 2006, I went back to Atlantic City to watch Bernard Hopkins turn back the hands of time and defeat Antonio Tarver. Fight went off as planned. There was no delay or anything like that. Now, keep in mind, UFC was building an audience at this time. There was no delay, no watching other combat sports. Fights went off as scheduled. In Georgia, going to local fights at guys at my old boxing gym. Going to local fights to support them. Fights, there was no delay. Fights started off on time. No issues or anything. In May of 2010, I was at the MGM Grand for the Floyd Mayweather and Shane Mosley fight. Yes, the same Shane Mosley fight where Floyd Mayweather was rocked in the second round, almost knocked down, almost knocked out, and Floyd came to do a complete wipeout afterwards. And again, there was no delay, there was nothing, and Mayweather was boxing's biggest star. And that's the fights that I attended in person, not even counting the millions of fights I've watched on pay-per-view, on Showtime pay-per-view, HBO pay-per-view, ESPN, anything. There was never really any delay. For the first time, your biggest star has been delayed in the start of a championship fight. He's actually moving up in weight. When I believe I mentioned this on the last broadcast, what Canelo Alvarez is doing is not necessarily an easy feat, because yes, and even though I did pick Alvarez to win the fight, but Kovalev is a bigger fighter, fought at that natural weight class, and Canelo Alvarez was making history. The last person who did that was Bernard Hopkins at the aforementioned Antonio Tarver fight, and the greatest of all time. Well, what experts agree, old experts agree, that Sugar Ray Robinson was the greatest fighter of all time. He couldn't even do that, and I mean move up from middleweight to win the light heavyweight title when he lost against Joey Maxim. So Canelo Alvarez was really making history. And I was noticing before that fight, there was no real promotion for that fight. You know, and I couldn't help but notice when it was a Sean Porter and Errol Spence fight, it was heavily promoted on Fox, heavily promoted on the Herd and all the different Fox affiliates because of their association with Al Heyman and Golden Boy Promotions. But I noticed there wasn't, a big advertising for Canelo Alvarez. And again, Canelo Alvarez is seen as your biggest star in the post-Mayweather era. And I knew something wasn't right because even other fight fans, not really hardcore fight fans, but your casual, I would say mid-grade casual to maybe hardcore, a lot of them didn't even know that Canelo Alvarez was fighting this particular weekend, or that particular weekend rather. So it definitely got me thinking. I said, well, wait a minute, this fight is not being promoted like I think it should, considering it's Canelo going up in weight, trying to make history, trying to win a version of the light heavyweight title. So, and I said, well, wait a minute, something's not going to be right. And the numbers came out recently. Now, in that particular fight, in the live gate generated $8,173,920. And the fight again was at the MGM Grand Arena, that, oh, by the way, has a maximum seat capacity of 17,157. That $8 million figure was generated from 10,005 ticket sales. So 10,005 ticket sales from a maximum capacity of 17,157. Interesting. The Nevada State Athletic Commission, they gave away 1,643 complimentary tickets, hence free tickets. So break this down. Canelo Alvarez, boxing's biggest star, was only able to sell 10,000 tickets in a 17,000 seat stadium or arena. Now, let's compare that with his fight against Daniel Jacobs at the T-Mobile Arena. Generated $8,685,750 and 15,000 tickets. And that arena opened up in 2017 with a maximum seating capacity of $20,000. 20,000 seats, excuse me. So understand this. Canelo Alvarez fighting a much bigger name in Sergey Kovalev, moving up in weight, from all appearances, fighting a much more dangerous opponent than Daniel Jacobs, generated less income, less ticket sales than a Daniel Jacobs fight. And you mean to tell me I should not question whether boxing is in serious trouble? And again, this is your biggest star. Let me say this again. Canelo Alvarez is seen as the biggest, most recognizable, most bankable star in boxing right now. That even includes guys like Vasyl Lomachenko, Errol Spence, Terrence Crawford, even Shakur Stevenson, Gervonta Tank Davis. Includes all these guys. Canelo Alvarez is seen as your biggest star in boxing, and his historic campaign did less numbers than when he fought a middleweight contender. That should really, really drive home the point that boxing might be in some trouble. Now, I personally think some of the reasons why boxing is in trouble And of course, you can disagree with me, you can agree with me, but this is just my opinion and why I created Chin Check Radio to get my thought process out there. Number one, I think one of the biggest reasons is that we have no HBO. And I knew that the world had changed, the landscape had changed when HBO decided to get out of the fight game after 45 years. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for all you fight fans who are listening right now, you know as well as I do the memories that we had watching fights on HBO. You knew Saturday night, if there was a fight, you knew you wanted to get together at somebody's house, whether it's going to be a fight party, whether you and your friends would be going back and forth like I still do to this day with some friends of mine when we watch fights and we have discussions and disagreements and, you know, who won this round and who won that round, and we debate back and forth. So you knew on Saturday night there was a fight on, there was a big fight in town, everybody was excited, everybody was ready, it got people talking, and it built stars. I think a part of that is when HBO decided to get out of the fight game. I think that really hurt boxing. Now, HBO is not without fault, and they're not without blame. They have to blame themselves for some of this. And some of the things that HBO failed on was not changing with the times, and they had a policy of only signing fighters through their promoters. Well, they decided to stop working with probably the biggest promoter, even though you don't see any sign, even though you don't hardly see any pictures of them. Stop working with Heyman Fighters. Now, they stopped working with Heyman Fighters. Now, me personally, from a business perspective, I respect Heyman because I feel that that's how you conduct business. That's how you be a power player. You stay behind the scenes and you make things happen. And if you look online, I think there's only 2 or 3 pictures online of Heyman. So, as a man personally and professionally, I respect how Heyman does business. But HBO decided to just flat out stop working with Heyman and Golden Boy Promotions. So because of that, you lose people like the Canelos and the Deontay Wilders and the Keith Thurmans and the Danny Garcias and the Adrian Broners. Well, anyway. Erislandy Lara, Abner Mares, Leah Santa Cruz. So when you lose those young fighters, that's going to hurt your network. A biggest thing that hurt HBO was losing Floyd Mayweather. Now, Floyd Mayweather, again, is the biggest star, best boxer of my era that I've seen growing up. And he began his rise on HBO from Pretty Boy Floyd Mayweather to Floyd Money Mayweather, and then signed a big-time deal on Showtime, and the rest is history. I think when you lose your biggest star, that kind of hurts you when you don't have any other equal stars to counteract that. When Mike Tyson was a big star on HBO before he went to prison, came back, signed with Showtime. At the time, now that was the rise of Oscar De La Hoya, Roy Jones Jr. So HBO was able to counter that with losing Mike Tyson over to Showtime. And you saw HBO still kept the ball rolling eventually as they created bigger stars. Felix Trinidad, you still had Pernell Whitaker. Again, you had Floyd Mayweather. You had Shane Mosley coming down the pike. So you still had a bunch of young contenders coming down the pike. So to me, when they lost Mayweather, I don't think they really recovered losing Mayweather. So I think that was part of the problem as well. They also lost Top Rank, Bob Arum's Top Rank, when he signed a deal with ESPN. Then now you lose Manny Pacquiao, who was another big star. You lost Terrence Crawford, another future star, as well as Triple G. So for boxing to be having some of the issues that they have now, HBO kind of messed things up. I think another reason why I think boxing, HBO kind of died, they're dead in terms of boxing coverage, is because I feel that when I used to watch the fights, you knew that your pay-per-view fights were reserved for your huge stars when they fought another huge star. So when your star fought another huge star or fought a reasonably huge star, Floyd Mayweather, Ricky Hatton, Floyd Mayweather, Manny Pacquiao, Oscar De La Hoya versus Ike Quartey, Oscar De La Hoya versus Sugar Shane Mosley, 1 and 2. You knew Oscar De La Hoya versus Fernando Vargas. You knew that Felix Trinidad versus Bernard Hopkins. You knew that these guys deserved to be in the moment. These guys fought their way up to the moment, and you knew that it was something special to watch these guys fight. Like, you knew when this pay-per-view fight was announced, it was going to be special. These guys were the best at their weight class, vying for a unified championship, trying to make their legacy or trying to add on to their legacy. So you felt a certain energy when you watched those fights. And I felt HBO started to kind of level off with that, when now you're putting just any old fight on pay-per-view. And and of course the pay-per-view fights went from $20 to $30 to $40 to $50 to $60 and so on and so forth. So now you're giving me less quality fights and you're charging me a higher amount of money. And you're putting on more frequent pay-per-view fights, charging me more money, and I'm getting less quality. So I think that actually hurt, I feel, a lot of the boxing public, where I feel a lot of fights that were on pay-per-view actually should have been on regular HBO to help build their stars, to help really build these stars or build the fighters into marketable and bankable stars. I felt HBO might have saw somebody, well, he looks like he can be a star, let's put him on pay-per-view, where he does not have that. He doesn't have that cult following, or he doesn't have the mainstream following where people want to part with their hard-earned money in order to support that fighter. So to me, that's why I think HBO really, really dropped the ball there. And this is somebody watching fights as a child on HBO. I think some other issues that happened was there seemed to be when I feel the announcers, I'm going to talk about specifically Larry Merchant here, and don't get me wrong, and enjoy watching Larry Merchant for the years, or listening to Larry Merchant the years he was on TV, his analysis, when he ties in historical perspectives regarding the fighters, I felt it was great, but I felt that he and some of the other broadcasters were starting to get a little bit bold in their criticism of guys who actually were boxers and not brawlers. And let's face it, this is the sweet science. On Chin Check Radio, we actually respect boxers. But I feel that HBO started to really come down on the boxers in favor of the brawlers. And listen to the commentary with Floyd Mayweather versus Carlos Baldomir. Now, before the fight, they kept saying how Carlos Baldomir walks around weighing 190 and he's a big featherweight, and Mayweather's not going to hurt this guy, and it's going to be the fight of Mayweather's life, and the guy's a feather dusters by trade, and that only makes him hungry, and Mayweather, sleeping in satin sheets, and it's going to be a tough fight for Mayweather and everything. By the fourth or fifth round, where Mayweather is totally dancing circles around this guy, then it turned into, oh, he's a boring fighter, he should knock the guy out, you can't put him up there with some of the best fighters of all time because he would knock the guy out. That was some of the issues that I had with HBO. Your job is to call a fight, not give your opinion on what the fighter should do and the strategies in the ring. And I feel that Larry Merchant in particular was starting to get real bold in his criticism of these fighters and not, quote, fighting what he deemed as an exciting fight, and in some cases calling it a boring fight. He called the Mayweather-Mosley fight a glorified sparring session. No, it's a boxing match. He made comments in the Antonio Tarver and the Bernard Hopkins fight. When Bernard Hopkins scored a knockdown, I believe in the fifth round, he said, well, they woke me up. As an analyst, that's not your job to make those comments. Your job is to analyze the action in the ring, not because you feel that there should be more action, or you got caught up in the storm of the UFC where you're hardcore fight fans and people who really don't know anything, or your vocal people, they want blood and they want guts and they want action, and now you want to condemn and criticize the pure boxer who has honed and mastered his craft, who is ducking and dodging and slipping and throwing punches and mixing up the combinations and boxing beautifully, and you want to criticize that particular fighter for being a boxer, but yet you want to praise the Ricardo Majorcas of the world and the guys, the Mickey Wards of the world, and the guys who can brawl. Well, let's face it, for us fight fans who understand there's the art and the science behind boxing, that only lasts for so long as a pure brawler, because why is that? We've seen time and time again a pure brawler, when he's in there with a boxer, he has taken the school and thoroughly outclassed. It looks like he shouldn't even be in the same ring, stadium, or city as that particular boxer. So I feel that's where I think HBO started getting a little bit too big for their britches, when you're starting to criticize on air criticizing fighters for how they fight. Now, we're not talking necessarily about choosing opponents, but when you start to criticize a fighter for fighting his fight and doing what he feels necessary to win this fight, I always felt that was a problem for announcers supposed to be biased and objective. Announcers on air are criticizing fighters but choosing to fight how they want to fight in order to win a particular boxing match. Also, there was hardly... Now, let's face it. Now, yes, they're going to tell you that America is a melting pot, and yes, it certainly is. The other problem with that is, with boxing, there was hardly any American stars towards the end. Hardly any American stars, or you did not market your American stars. Let's go into that. Now, you had the Mike Tysons, the Sugar Ray Leonards, the Oscar De La Hoyas, the Bernard Hopkins, the Roy Joe Jr.'s, the Manny Pacquiao's. You know, even though Pacquiao, yes, is a foreigner, but his style resonated with American fans. You got to the point where you're watching HBO fights, you have much more interpreters in the corner. You're really pushing the Vitaly Klitschko's and the Vladimir Klitschko's. At that time, during their era, there was hardly any American top heavyweights. We recently saw the rise of Deontay Wilder, and that rise was on Showtime, not HBO. So when you don't have any bankable American stars, because let's face it, Americans will get behind American stars, especially in the world of boxing. Now, one can make an argument, Mayweather was your bankable American star, but again, when you have broadcasters like Larry Merchant getting into it with Mayweather on the air and he leaves for a ride with Showtime, the next thing you know, that's going to take a lot of the audience with you. So then you're wondering why your boxing coverage has died and why the sport as a whole is suffering is because of that reason. Hardly any bankable American stars. Andre Ward was a bankable American star, but he decided to retire early, and that's fine by him. So you really need, especially America, to get the American audience behind. Now, yes, you can bring... We all know when Canelo fights, that brings in a Mexican audience. When Felix Trinidad fought, that brings in a Puerto Rican audience. But when you want that American audience, the people who's really, really going to be paying for this stuff is your American audience, and you need bankable American stars to really get the public going. Another thing is too, and I never thought I'd say this, say what you want, but for years ago when Don King and Bob Arum, for the most part, ran boxing, you always heard that you need a situation where take it out of the hands of promoters and hopefully have fighters are promoters, because being that fighters own the business and promoters, they took advantage of the fighters. And part of that is true, but have you noticed that boxing is actually worse now? The fact that fighters are actually promoting other fights, and yet Don King is now in his 80s. I'm sure Bob Arum is in his 80s, so these guys basically have one foot in the grave. And my thing is, the sport itself, the coverage, everything has gotten worse since the fighters, the Mayweathers, since Oscar De La Hoya. And don't get me wrong, I respect the fact that they took control of their careers and they were big enough names and big enough fighters to build their own brand where they were able to be bigger than a promoter. So I respect that in the game. I'm not taking anything away from that, and I'm glad they did what they did. But I couldn't help but notice that now, since boxing is really in the hands of the Golden Boy promotions and Oscar De La Hoya and Al Heyman and Floyd Mayweather, boxing as a whole, the coverage is less and less and less versus back then when Don King and Bob Arum, some maybe say Don Elbaum, Butch Lewis, the late great Butch Lewis, when they were promoting fights, boxing was what we knew boxing to be. Now, the fighters, former fighters, are now the promoters, and we see that there's still issues with trying to promote fights. So I'm really trying to understand that. I'm really trying to wrap my head around that. But just some food for thought. Don King ran the show, Bob Arum ran the show, Don Elbaum ran the show, Butch Lewis ran the show, Lou DiBella. Boxing, we knew boxing as we knew boxing. Floyd Mayweather, Oscar De La Hoya, partnered with Bernard Hopkins. Now all of a sudden, the sport as a whole is suffering. And to me, what really drove it home, why I think boxing is in serious trouble, there was some internet celebrity fight between a KSI and a Logan Paul. And ESPN did a whole article about celebrity boxing and who fought who, and that was popular for the sport. And Steve Kim, in an ESPN article on November the 10th, 2019, writes about that fight, 12,000 people packed the Staples Center to watch an internet fight or some internet celebrity boxing between two guys, two YouTube stars. And I could give a damn about that. The fact that fight got so much coverage in mainstream media, so much. I mean, the fight was advertised on ESPN. Apparently, this was their rematch, and the fight was advertised, and yet your biggest star cannot get the same love. Now, let's go back to the numbers again. Canelo Alvarez versus Sergey Kovalev for the light heavyweight title. Pull your pens and paper on this, ladies and gentlemen. 10,005 tickets sold at the MGM Grand, which is considered maybe Madison Square Garden, but I would say Vegas, the capital of boxing. Canelo Alvarez versus Sergey Kovalev in Las Vegas, 10,000 tickets were sold. KSI versus Logan Paul, 12,000 tickets were sold. Folks, is this damn thing on? You mean to tell me an internet celebrity YouTube stars in the ring boxing sold more tickets than your most bankable, recognizable star in boxing? Ladies and gentlemen, if that is not a red flag, I don't know what is. And Steve Kim put in his article to say that the fight was good for boxing is probably one of the most asinine things I've ever read. And he tried to compare it to say, well, if you're talking about that's a circus, then what about the circus with Muhammad Ali fighting a young Larry Holmes or other old veterans fighting against young upstarts? Well, that's kind of how boxing works, Steve Kim. And number two, Muhammad Ali already had a name behind it. And number one, that's how boxing works. You grow old and the young guys come up and they knock you off your porch. That's kind of how that works. I don't really see that as a bad thing. Of course, my issue when you have some of the old guys fighting the younger guys is when the old guys are in trouble, stop the fight. I think part of the problem is to let the fights go on too long when a fighter is clearly outclassed. That's what I think the problem is. Not necessarily an old fighter in the ring with the young fighter. So let me go ahead and debunk that. Number two, Muhammad Ali and some of these older fighters who fight these young fighters already have name recognition, so that's actually going to draw in viewers. You figure Muhammad Ali, especially at that time, now that was what, the year I was born, when he fought Larry Holmes, Muhammad Ali was already a legend and icon, and people thought that Muhammad Ali can actually turn back the hand of time and beat a younger Larry Holmes. Number three, there's an old saying, and the late Custom Model even once said it, that every now and again, a great fighter has one last great fight in him. So we've seen plenty of times, see Bernard Hopkins, where he's, quote, the older fighter, sent out there to pasture and ends up turning back the hands of time and smacking around a young competitor. So we've seen that time and time again. I think of Larry Holmes versus Ray Mercer. So I think of plenty of times where an older fighter who was sent out there to lose ends up walking out of a victory. We just had some recent fight. Manny Pacquiao. I talked about this in the Manny Pacquiao versus Keith one-time Thurman review. I know I spoke about that. Shawn Pascal, former light heavyweight title holder, he recently turned back the hands of time. So to me, that Steve Kim, that was a bunch of nonsense. That fight was not good for boxing. If anything, that fight should really be an indictment on boxing, where two internet clowns was able to generate more tickets sales than your most bankable, recognizable star at the moment. So to me, the reason why I created Chin Check Radio is when people read that article, again, ESPN is on a bigger platform than we are. We're an upstart program, but this is why I created Chin Check Radio. For somebody reading that crap can be like, that absolutely makes no sense. The fight was not good for boxing. There was nothing to analyze. There was nothing to break down. All it was for simple bragging rights. There was no legacy on the line. There was no being as part of the Immortals, having your name talked about for years on end. People watch your fights for years on end. These fighters that I talk about, the Tysons and the Holyfields and the De La Hoyas and the Bernard Hopkins and of course the Alis and the Pernell Whitakers and the Trinidad, are guys whose names will live on for a long time, even long after their careers are gone. And of course, these guys, when you talk about fantasy matchups, which we are going to do on Chin Check Radio, we're going to do different fantasy matchups, are these guys when you talk about who would beat who from this particular era. So that bothered me. So in reading that article, to tell me that fight wasn't bad for boxing, to me, I felt it was an insult to every boxing fan. And an internet boxing match between two nobodies in terms of boxing, I don't know their YouTube thing, but two guys, nobodies in the world of professional boxing, they generated more ticket sales than your best fighter, your most recognizable, and your most bankable fighter. To me, boxing needs to get it together because that's not a good look. And if your biggest star is struggling to draw in tickets, if your biggest star, if one of his biggest fights is not being promoted, that's a serious problem. And again, you still have Errol Spence, who was involved in a recent car accident, as we talked about on another broadcast. Who knows if he'll be the same? I like to think that being he's in top physical shape as a professional boxer, he should be back in the ring in no time. Let's get him in the ring with Terrence Crawford. We have the Javante Tank Davis coming up in Atlanta. We have Shakur Stevenson, if he's brought along the right way. We have Vasyl Lomachenko. So you have Deontay Wallace fighting Luis King Kong Ortiz again. We're going to do our review of that fight in a couple of weeks. So this is just my thing and my opinions as to why I think boxing is in serious trouble. I'm not going to say it's a dying sport, but it's in serious trouble. It's a little bit unhealthy right now, and you're going to need a serious jolt to get the sport up and running again. And boxing needs to do something. The powers that be need to do something, and the networks they need to do something. Other fight fans, like you all listen to our program right now, we all need to get behind and start raising hell and to get on these promoters and these fighters to give us the best fights, to promote these fights, to get the public's appetite, wet to really get these fights going that we want to see. Hopefully we get the Tyson Fury and the Deontay Wilder rematch, where that fight is for the heavyweight championship of the world. We got the Anthony Joshua rematch. Let's see what he does. We're going to analyze that fight. So there are many things in boxing that's coming up on the horizon to prove that the sport is not dead, but it's in serious trouble. And I think people need to rally behind and get behind and start raising hell to get our beloved sport that gave us so many memories for years. It's not people spit on his face, try to tap dance on his grave, and to disrespect the sport that we see on a daily basis. I feel it's disgusting, and it's time for us to raise some hell and start trying to get the sport back to what we love to do and watch, enjoy, and talk about, and even argue about playfully. This is Chin Check Radio signing off, and until the next time.